the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Mark Peasney, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science, but more importantly, in the last several years, has been running the whole College of Arts and Sciences, and who is one of the people who has authorized support for the program tonight. So we have a couple people, or a couple organizations I'd like to thank for that. Of course, the International Studies Institute is helping support it, but also the Dean, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Women's Studies Program, the Feminist Research Institute, the Religious Studies Program, and the Jewish Community Center have all contributed in different ways to helping this event occur. So with that said, I'm going to invite Dean Peasney to come up to introduce our speaker.
So I thank the people at the back of the room. I'm going to start by saying that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And then the scary part, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. It's an especially auspicious time to have our speaker today come to share her work with us, because we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of this 19th Amendment. And today's talk is ideally suited to help us understand how the rights of women in our society have evolved over 100 years, and how Jewish feminism has been a critical part of deepening those rights and extending them, and at least bringing us to a point where we're at least well ahead of where we were 100 years ago. But I'm especially pleased to be here because, as I'm sure many people know, this is a difficult time for our nation. It's a difficult time for us to figure out how to really fully embrace all of the ideals that were built into that Constitution, if imperfectly, at its origin. And how we can figure out how to live in peace and harmony and in cooperation with respect for one another, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender. And for me, it's been an especially wonderful opportunity for many years now to be a participant in the Contemporary Jewish Studies lecture series. And I want to thank all of the donors from the Community Foundation and others who have made it possible for us to have a series of extraordinary speakers who have been able to help us struggle with all of these things on a regular basis. And it's exactly the kind of thing that a flagship university should do. Have the opportunity to have world-class scholars come and share their wisdom with us in ways that serve students, faculty, staff, and our community. So thank everyone who has made this possible. And it's a special pleasure to introduce our guest, Joyce Antler, who is the Samuel Lane Professor of American Jewish History and Culture and a Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis University. By the way, we're finally getting around to adopting that as the name for our program here. It's something that will happen in the next year. It has been Women's Studies, and it will embrace that broader mandate in the near future. Dr. Antler is the author or editor of 10 books, including The Journey Home, How Jewish Women Shaped Modern America, Talking Back, Images of Jewish Women in American Popular Culture, and the prize-winning documentary drama, Year One of the Empire. Actually, is it still the most recent book, or is there another one that just came out?
Yeah, last year.
I have an old bio, so I will get this back. So until very recently, the most recent book was You Never Call, You Never Write, The History of the Jewish Mother, which won the Emily Toth Award from the Popular Culture Association, American Culture Association, for the best book on women's issues. And now we have Jewish Radical Feminism, Voices from the Women's Liberation Movement, which is central to her topic for today, Jewish Feminism and Women's Liberation, Perspectives from 50 Years of Activism. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you all very much for coming for this talk. I turn it over to you.
I am delighted to be here this afternoon in your beautiful city, and I am speaking on behalf of the Association of Jewish Studies Distinguished Lecture Program, and I would like to thank Stephen Bishop and Loyola Chastain of this university for their tremendous courtesy and helpfulness in making all the arrangements. And there seem to have been so many other groups involved. Steve mentioned them, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Women's Studies Program, the Feminist Research Center, the Religion Department, the Jewish Federation, the Jewish Community Federation, the League of Women Voters. If I've forgotten anybody, I'm awfully sorry. It looks like it certainly was a team effort. And thank you so much, and to the wonderful donors who really made this whole afternoon possible. And I'm very eager to speak to you about my most recent book, which is on Jewish radical feminism. In a previous book, which the Dean mentioned, The Journey Home, I talked about the earlier history of Jewish women active in political life, in voting rights, and all of that. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different today, and maybe a little bit harder to hear, but we will get through it. And I want to begin by saying that I think it's really important to make the contributions of women, feminists, and my topic today, Jewish feminists, visible. For too long, their extraordinary accomplishments have been hidden, or shall I say subsumed, within the general population of American women and Americans generally. Now, Jews, of course, live in the larger society, but I argue that it's important to tell their stories as Jews, with the full specificity and complexity these stories deserve. But it's often not very easy. My work on Jewish radical feminists is part of a larger and longer project to bring the lives of Jewish women into the narratives of both American history and American Jewish history, where unfortunately they have been missing as well. Because of the inattention of historians and other scholars, and I'm one of them myself, so I'm blaming myself, the achievements of these women and their lives, including their distinct identities as Jews, have gone unobserved. And when we don't know our history, we're missing a vital legacy, a legacy for ourselves and especially for the younger generation. So I hope that my book and my talk this afternoon helps us to understand in more nuanced ways who Jewish radical feminists were, how they transformed our society, and how the changes they wrought became integral parts of American and Jewish culture. And I believe that these stories will help us recognize our own identities as Jews and as other kinds of ethnicities, our values, traditions, struggles, our triumphs. At a time when anti-Semitism, ethno-nationalism, and white supremacy have become increasingly prominent in international affairs and in our national life as well, we need to intensify our fight against hatred and prejudice, to know who we are as a people, where we have come from, and why we should be proud of our history is an important weapon in this effort. So let me begin by telling you why I wrote the book, what its structure is, what its guiding principles are, and give you some examples of the fascinating Jewish women I talk about. I tell the story of over 40 women, most of whom I interviewed. These were women who were central to women's liberation, to the women's health movement, to reproductive rights. They also include religious women who sought to transform Jewish prayer, liturgy, and theology, get rid of the patriarchy. They include lesbian feminists. They include Jewish women who conducted anti-racist campaigns, campaigns against anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In the book, as one reviewer said, I chart the dreams, the ambitions, the political visions, and the far-ranging accomplishments of a generation of Jewish women activists, most of whom we do not know. While I'm discussing these more recent women, I do want to say one word about women's suffrage, because today we acknowledge the women who were active in the suffrage movement and the achievement of suffrage 100 years ago. So let me point out that Jewish women were involved in this movement. They were active in the struggle. I might mention Ernestine Rose. How many people know the name of Ernestine Rose? Okay, 3. Maud Nathan. How many people know the name of Maud Nathan? 1. Clara Lemlich-Shavelson, who started the Wage Earning League of Women's Suffrage, who was a labor activist. Another 1. This is not to say that people of Albuquerque are not up on your game. This is to say that the stories of these women are missing from the historical record, from the record of suffrage. It's also to say that we have a problem in the failure to credit Jews and Jewish women for their significant contribution to women's suffrage, and also to acknowledge anti-Semitism within the movement. Sometimes I'm the bearer of bad tidings, and I apologize. But about Ernestine Rose, and I think she got 3 people who raised their hands, it was said by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. How many people know Elizabeth Cady Stanton? Okay, you see the difference? Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that Ernestine Rose was, and I'm paraphrasing, one of the most significant women in the history of women's suffrage. So there's a lot we need to know about this subject, but that's for another time. I'm going to talk today about radical feminism and the role of Jewish women in that movement. And by radical feminism, I'm talking about women's liberation, a movement that kind of started in the 1960s and the 1970s. Some of us were around at that time. I'm not so much talking about liberal feminism. And liberal feminism and radical feminism, women's liberation, all of these terms, they often get confused. But what we can say is that these movements transformed our lives. I remember that when I came out of college, when I went into college, when I came out of college, the help wanted ads were listed men and women. Do you remember that? You couldn't get a credit card if you were married on your own, just to give you a few examples. We don't live in that world anymore. And for that, we have to thank the women of the feminist movement. But there is a difference between the group that I'm calling radical and the group that I'm calling liberal. The liberal feminists are those kind of led by Betty Friedan. Raise your hand if you've heard of Betty Friedan. Bella Abzug, Gloria Steinem. These were women who were born, say, in the 1920s, and by and large, they believed in change through economic and political gradualism, fundamental change, but through the means at our disposal. The radical feminists came a little bit later. They were born in the late 40s for the most part, some in the early 50s, and they believed in change from the bottom up, from the roots, a radical restructuring of society. And the terms consciousness raising, sisterhood is powerful, all of these came from the radical women. That's the group that I am talking about. And as I said, I interviewed and wrote about more than 40 of them. And there are many, many books about the feminist movement, about women's liberation, which I use kind of synonymously with radical feminism. Many, many books. How many of those books do you think mention Jewish women? How about 0? How about 0? And what proportion of this movement might have been Jewish? Well, how many Jewish women participated in this movement? Many, how about 2/3 to 3/4? But not mentioned. And that's not surprising because we don't know the women who were involved in suffrage. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think the fact is that Jewish women are American women, and so we don't see them separately. And I make the case in this book, it is important to look at the contribution, as I said, of Jewish women as Jews, and to try and understand what we lose when we don't have this perspective to understand our own history. So by and large, they were considered white women at the time, although today there are many Jews of color. At the time in the women's movement, these were in fact white women, although they themselves, if you talk to them, considered themselves not quite white. But that's, we will get to that. So we have a very partial view if we don't consider the Jewish women as Jews involved in this. And let me mention the historian David Hollinger, who's in California. He is an intellectual historian who writes about ethnic history. He's not himself Jewish, but he said something I think quite profound, maybe about 10 years ago. And he said, you know why people don't pay enough attention to American Jewish history? He said, that's because the historians write very narrowly about Jewish history. They write about what Jews do in their communal organizations, in the federations, in their synagogues, in their neighborhoods, all very important, not to knock that, but that he called communalist history. He said, but what historians don't write about is what he called dispersionist history, what the Jews who were dispersed throughout society do. The artists, the physicists, the scientists, and his prime example, David Hollinger, not himself Jewish, of what historians miss when they miss this lens was the radical feminist movement, and particularly, I'm going to come to it, the women's health movement, Our Bodies, Ourselves. I believe he got this from my own book, which came out, by the way, The Journey Home was written in 1997, and I had a few pages on this subject that now became a 440-page book. Had a few pages on Jewish women in the women's liberation movement, and I waited for 20 years for somebody to take up the story. Nobody did, so I figured, okay, you better do it. While these women are still with us, and you know, in fact, some of them are not. So I felt that it was important to tell the story of Jewish women in the movement and to understand in what ways they were Jewish. And I divided my book into two parts. In the first part, I tell the stories of 20 women who were Jewish but didn't specifically identify as Jewish. It's not that they were denying, some of them were, but some of them were not. They just were involved in their collectives, in their social change movements, in their universities, in their organizations as people. They weren't Jewish people, they were just people, 20 of them. And in the second part, I had 20 people who were identified with Jewish organizations. And I had a conference at NYU some years ago before I wrote the book, and I brought 40 of these women together. Not all of them made it to the book, but many of them did. And lo and behold, it was a very exciting conference, a 2-day conference. People who went felt, I'm sorry, thank you. People felt it was it was so exciting. They didn't generally know each other. They had been active in kind of different groups, but they didn't necessarily know each other, those who were not identified and those who were Jewishly identified. So I felt that it was important to bring them together, and I do in the book, and I do in real life. And I have a wonderful anecdote to tell you about that if somebody will remind me at the end so I don't forget. Because these women had a lot in common. And the first thing they had in common was, it was the fact of sexism on the male left and in the male student movement and in organizations in which they had male comrades. Sorry to say this, but it was the fact of sexism that propelled them into thinking about feminism. So whether we're talking about the National Conference for New Politics, the Nixon counter-inaugural, or the Jewish student meetings at Zieglerville. No reason that you'd know about this. These women felt that some of their best friends, their men who were their friends, were not really taking them as women seriously. And the first women's group of this sort in the country happened in 1967. Two things happened in 1967 at the National Conference for a New Politics. There were 3,000 student activists who came to Chicago to promote their own candidate before the 1968 election. There was a women's caucus, and the women's caucus came up with some demands, and the chair would not allow the women to speak. And he spoke to the person who created these demands, a young Orthodox Jew, Shulamith Firestone. She was very small. Maybe some of you have heard of Shulamith Firestone. Okay, that's encouraging. And he said, you know, go home, little girl. We don't need your demands right now. And Shulamith didn't go home. She started what became the first women's liberation group in the country, the West Side Group in Chicago in 1967 and 1968. And I came to this topic, although I've told you I wrote another book about and had a seed of this, but I came to focus on the story that I tell by meeting some of the women in that first group, the Chicago West Side Group. There were 4 women who wrote an article about their experience in Chicago West Side Group, and they called their article Our Gang of 4, Female Friendship and Women's Liberation. And it was in a book about the feminist movement. And I was reading this article, and I thought to myself, those women are Jewish. They didn't mention it. Now, their names were Naomi Weinstein. Here's Naomi. She's on the cover of my book. Vivian Rothstein, Amy Kesselman, and Heather Tobis Booth. Now, you must be thinking, what a detective I am. Kesselman, Rothstein, Weinstein, Tobis Booth. You know, they're Jewish, but they didn't mention it. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. They're writing about female friendship and women's liberation. So I wrote to Amy, who I knew slightly, and I said, Amy, I just read this article. It's fantastic. It was the first article in a very important collection. I said, you're all Jewish. And she said, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. We've been together. We wrote this article together in 1998. This was 2008, 10 years later. We've been together for 40 years, and we never discussed it. We never discussed it. She said, this is something, let's have a conference call. I said, fine. Naomi, everybody has a conference call. Naomi, who passed away about 2 years ago, had been quite ill. She was a leading neuroscientist of great renown, the founder of the Chicago Women's Liberation Rock Band when she was younger. So she couldn't go anywhere. She couldn't get out of her bed. Got on the phone with the 4 of us and me, and she said, I really can't talk. Just maybe 10 minutes we'll have this phone call. 2 hours later, when we were talking about the Jewishness in their lives and what they had missed, we got off the phone. I was saying, well, no more. And Naomi said, let's have another phone call about the Holocaust. And we did. We had, after 40 years, we discussed this. And then I wrote up a draft of an article, and I sent it to them. And I hadn't published it yet, but I sent it to them. Naomi said, well, I didn't say this. This was about anti-Semitism on the left as one of the reasons why they didn't identify as Jews at the height of the student protest and women's movement. And I said, it was a conference call. I recorded it. You said it, but let's get it in a form that it's good for you and it's good for me, so we did. We worked hard on it. And then Naomi said, we're no longer our gang of 4, we are our gang of 5 with me. I'm the 5th, on the way to the synagogue. As they were able to embrace their Jewishness and really talk about its significance and why they forgot it. I don't know if you know Heather Booth, but I think she's one of the most extraordinary organizers and change agents in this country. For 50 years, there's a film about her. Whenever she goes, she really talks about my encouragement for bringing these women together and for looking at some of these issues. So I wrote this book in the form of, the first part was about Jewish women like this group who hadn't acknowledged their Jewishness, and I organized it according to collectives. So there was the Chicago group, there was a New York group called Red Stockings, in Boston there was Bread and Roses, and there was also the health book collective, Our Bodies, Ourselves. On the other side, the Jewish feminist side, there was Ezrat Nashim, which called for greater religious rights for women, and a lesbian collective called Devil Dechaya, the Wild Women, with Adrienne Rich, and quite a number of other collectives, because it seemed to me collective is a form of Jewish worship held dear to Jews. And for women in the women's movement, the historian Linda Gordon says of the women's movement, collective, and I quote, is a sacred liturgical word, and individualist a damnation. So it makes sense to talk about these women in this way. And I also, in each chapter, tells the story of separate women. So from 4 to 6, sometimes even more, women not grouped in one lump, not one or two essences, but individual stories. And that's another thing that I really believe, that the histories of all of us have similar elements, but they're different. And it's really important to talk about these differences. In the Our Bodies, Ourselves chapter, there are 9 women, 6 Jewish and 3 who were not Jewish. They've been together, Our Bodies, Ourselves, going to be 50 years. 50 years, they know each other very well. I don't know if everybody here knows about this health book collective. It began in 1969, and it was an effort to allow women to take control over their own health. At that time, they started out by trying to make a list in Boston of the doctors they could trust, the male doctors they could trust, and they got together, all 11 of them, and they didn't have any names. And they said, we need to do this ourselves. So of these 11 women in this group, as in my other groups, how many were Jewish? 8. 8 out of the 11. And this group was a little bit different than some of the others because they recognized their Jewishness as opposed to the other groups which didn't. So a little bit different. Why did they recognize their Jewishness? Because there was one of the women named Esther Rome, who died of breast cancer, alas, some 20 years ago, was very central to the group, and she was a religious woman. She was observant, she kept kosher. When they had meetings, she insisted that the food was proper. She wouldn't go to any other meetings, and this was at a time, if some of you can recall those days, when religion was very suspect in the social change movement. They didn't believe that religion could be very good. And here was this leading social change progressive who was in her personal life very traditional. And Shabbat, all these holidays had to be exactly right. So she established a tone of respect for religion, and there was an acknowledgement on the part of others of the holidays, of the life cycles, of the rituals that made this group very different. But yet, nobody in all the many articles and books about Our Bodies, Ourselves, nobody named them as Jewish. They named other kinds of things. I was the first to do it, and that's controversial. In other words, should we label a particular group that did not self-identify or identify in the public realm as this? But I try to understand in my work, if you're going to label something Jewish or something else, what does that mean? Where does this come from? And in the example that I gave you of Esther Rome, one of the non-Jewish founders, Norma Swenson, talked about the Jewishness of the group mattered a great deal. She said being Jewish meant being different, being not quite white. In the case of Esther, it was a kind of, and I quote, dogged scholarship that refused to give up. While Esther might have been working on toxic shock syndrome, her work, said this other founder, belongs in the Smithsonian. She worked as a Jewish scholar. She worked with tremendous Talmudic attention to detail and this kind of critical thinking, this insistence on getting it right and going to the end and collaborating with others was very Jewish. So if you think that our bodies, ourselves, and the 25 million copies of books that it sold around the world makes any difference, then maybe it does make a difference that 8 out of the 11 founders were Jewish and worked together. I think the holiday observance, the respect for tradition. Oh, I forgot to mention the sense of themselves as a family. That was another part of it. When I spoke to some of these people, the Jewishness was important, the observing of ritual. They began to be together, their children, their parents, friends would come to these larger gatherings, and they began to see themselves as a family. And now they are, as I said, celebrating their 50th together. So the stories are very different. And before I tell you a little bit more about the second part, let me talk about some of the more problematic issues that I came upon. New York. New York is always a problem. I'm from New York, so that's, I have a license to say that. But when I spoke to some of the people in New York, that women's radical feminist group, one of the major ones was called Red Stockings. And there were two prominent people I can tell you about, Red Stockings and also New York radical women. They kind of went back and forth. Susan Brown Miller is an interesting person. I see some heads nodding. Susan Brown Miller, now in her 80s, gave us the landmark book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape. I think that's the subtitle. Came out in 1975, and it was the first book that looked at rape as systematic violence against women, the very first. But Susan Brown Miller also wrote a history of the women's movement. She's a writer, and she was a participant in the movement, and she wrote this book in 1999. It's called Memoir of Our Time. Now, I better not to, I might have the wrong title for that. But I went to see Susan, and I said, I'm doing this book about Jewish women in the women's movement. You don't talk about that in your book, and she did not. She didn't have any index reference to it. There was one reference to the word Jewish, and that was when the Catholic women was saying, oh, there go the Jewish women. They talk loud, they talk, whatever. But Susan hadn't noted it, but I went to see her and I said, Susan, for this book you interviewed 200 people. And most of her interviews were at the Schlesinger Library, which is the library for women's history at Radcliffe College, Harvard. Very available to me, and I said, shall I go and look at your interviews? Can I have access to them? And she said, don't bother, because I didn't ask anybody about Jewish. It never came up. You'll be wasting your time. So I really didn't. And not to say that Susan was lacking in inspiration at the time. This is just how it was. People did not think that way. They didn't think that way when they went down for the civil rights movement. They didn't go as Jews. They didn't think that way when they were protesting the war. They just didn't think that way. But Susan herself, if I could find a proper quote, or I can paraphrase it, later on when she talked to me and she talked to my colleagues at the Jewish Women's Archive in Boston, she talked about her insight into rape against women, and she said, that came from my understanding of violence against Jews. That came from my understanding of pogroms and the Holocaust. I never would have connected rape as a systematic violence towards women if I didn't understand the Holocaust. And at this point, she was certainly willing to think of herself as a Jew. She's a staunch defender of Israel. She talked about wanting to be a rabbi when she grew up in Brooklyn, but it wasn't allowed. So there it was. But Susan is one woman from the New York group. and it didn't appear in any of the work. Another is Alex Kate Shulman, a wonderful novelist, also in her 80s, and just an outstanding, important feminist. And she said to me kindly, when I visited her, she said, "This doesn't make any sense, really, what you're doing. It's really not important." You know, when we had our group, the Red Stockings, which existed for 10, 15, 20 years, it stopped and it started. I know those people, we all knew each other. We didn't know what anybody's religion was. We didn't know who was Catholic, who was Jewish. We didn't know, we didn't care. The women's movement wasn't about religion. It was about sex. It was about class. So, you know, you're kind of off on a tangent. But of course, we have discussed it over the years, and I don't know how she feels about this now, but that certainly was a pushback of many women. Not the same for the women of the Chicago group, who Alex said, well, they didn't talk about being Jewish. At least they knew each other was Jewish. Our group, we didn't know, we didn't care. So let me say something about the Jewish side and talk about their struggles. And I mentioned before that anti-Semitism was a factor in why they didn't identify. There were other reasons. At that time, for some of them, the role of women in Jewish religion was not to be admired. They distanced themselves from it. They might have felt that Jewish culture itself was materialistic, too suburban. This was a time of, you know, radical change. There's a host of reasons why they felt they didn't need to say who they were. Now, those who identified as Jewish had their own struggles. And here, let me read a little note from the newsletter Brooklyn Bridge. And it's 12 women who get together in 1971 for the first Jewish women's group, not a religious group. We sat in a circle, forced smiles on our faces, 12 women with histories of struggling to be free, to be whole in the women's movement. But to them it seemed outlandish to talk about what it meant to be a Jewish woman. I quote, "The Jewish women went to Hadassah meetings." Sorry for those of you who are from Hadassah. And we're trying to escape that, along with the hypocrisy, the lifestyle. Why are we walking back into it now? We felt Jewish, but we didn't know what that meant. And finally, we unembarrassed each other of our experiences as Jewish. We had to reclaim those experiences. And then there were the women of Ezrat Nashim, those women, Martha Ecclesburg, Judith Plaskow, names you might know, and 10 others, went together to sit in on the conservative Jewish assembly, the rabbinical assembly, and called for change. And they didn't realize that that would lead to tremendous change, not only in that movement, but in Reform Judaism and elsewhere. And they have their stories too. But it wasn't easy to kind of struggle against your mentors, your community, people you were tied to. They loved Jewish tradition, but they didn't like the way women were treated in it. So let's acknowledge their struggles too. And for Jewish women who kind of told themselves, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to acknowledge who we are within the women's movement, that was another level of struggle. There was Susan Schechter, a woman who lived around the corner from me, who started one of the key leaders in the battered women's movement, went to a socialist feminist conference in the 70s, and she wrote, "Everyone in our newly formed Jewish Women's Caucus was scared. Thoughts of being laughed at for making a big deal over being Jewish made us tremendously uncomfortable, yet we had a joyous gathering." She wrote about how scary it was to talk about Israel in this context. To talk about Israel in this context. In the last chapter, I do talk about Israel. I talk about 3 UN women's conferences. I don't know how many of you know about these, but American Jewish feminism goes global in the 70s and 80s. There was a conference in Mexico City one in Copenhagen and one in Nairobi, one later on in China, but these I'm talking about 75, 80, and 85, where Jewish women, and particularly Israeli women, were told that Zionism is racism. This was the first conference, 1975, that preceded actually the UN declaration that Zionism is racism in 1976. So it was the feminists who were saying to American women and European women, third world lives matter, Jewish women are oppressors, Zionism is racism. And for some Jewish women, like Letty Pogrebin, who wrote a long piece, Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement, 11 pages in Ms. Magazine, it became a turning point, a declaration of, if this is what they're telling us, it's time for me to declare myself and declare my identity. But it was difficult and tough. We could talk more about that. And maybe I should bring this to, I don't know how we are in terms of time, but to tell you what I found in looking at these 40 women and why I felt it is so powerful to use the Jewish lens. I felt that in spite of the tremendous diversity, in spite of the kaleidoscopic lens, which I mentioned I use, there were important commonalities. And those were related to Jewish backgrounds, to Jewish values, differently for different people, but I think as a package, they were all there. Number one was the sense of themselves as outsiders as well as insiders. While Jews were doing well in the homes that they grew up in the schools that they grew up into, they didn't quite feel that they were insiders, so the sense of being outsiders. Two, assertiveness. These women were able to recast the negative valence of Jewish women's bold behavioral style of being too loud, being too aggressive, of being too dominant, into something positive. And they, together in their own groups, sort of put forward a new kind of leadership that was important, not only in personal ways, but in terms of what they accomplished in their states and in our country. So leadership through assertiveness. Going along with that, number three, a propensity to challenge authority. That was there almost in every single case. Four, critical thinking. And this was at a time when, you remember, women were getting together and exploring every aspect of their lives, forming consciousness-raising circles and talking about what was important to them. So it was heavy and it could be painful, but the critical thinking often led to leaps, like Our Bodies, Ourselves, like Judith Plaskow, who was a member of Ezrat Nashim and who became a very important theologian, wrote the book Standing Again at Sinai, which challenges almost everything we know about theology. So critical thinking is very important. Number five, Jewish values. And this is a little tricky because values are always amorphous. What do we mean by values? Values differ. And they come from both spiritual sources, from Jewish practice, from Jewish texts, but also secular sources. Could be Yiddishkeit, could be other kinds of practice and text. And those generally were values that relate to social justice, to fairness, to empathy. As Meredith Tax, one of the women in the Boston group, Bread and Roses, said, our prophetic values simply told us that which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. Those are our values. Number six, and this perhaps surprised me a little bit given the age of these women, the importance of remembering history and specifically the Holocaust. The Holocaust was there for this generation of women, the importance of historical memory and the Holocaust. As I said in the beginning, Naomi said we need to have a special session and talk about it. And finally, Zionism. At a time when, today, Zionism may be suspect, it's important to note that some of these women, substantial numbers of them, got their sense of themselves as activists, got their sense of fairness and empathy from labor Zionism, from Zionist models, and were able to see the positives in this. So there's a lot more to say about this. I end my book with an epilogue where I have profiles of 6 women who were much younger. They were, at the time I wrote this, which was just last year, in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I tried to position them in terms of these foremothers. Some of them were actually the daughters of the women that I talk about. And I think their perspective is interesting too, because they were able to take from these stories, the stories of their mothers and other people of this generation, lessons about feminist change, about Jewish life, and use it in positive ways. They didn't throw out Jewish tradition. They kept Jewish tradition either frontally or on the side, but they were very enthusiastic about the values of diversity and pluralism. These really came to the fore. One of the women, and I think I will end here, was mentioned in today's paper. Some of you may have read at the very controversial Women's March. And we can go into this, the Women's March, which there were a couple of members who sort of disinvited Jewish women to be part of the coalition of feminists working for change. And some of these women were taken off the board, and new women were put on the board. And of the Jewish women, there's Rabbi Tamara Cohn, who is in my book and who speaks very enthusiastically about Jewish role models, but also about diversity. So again, let me say that through history, through knowing about our role models, I think we can come to a sense of our own histories that are empowering, that make us bold, and can help us in ways of leadership. So thank you very much.
Thank you. How would you characterize, or just talk about women, Jewish women in supporting the queer movement, and how that helped sort of propel that into specifically gay and lesbian Jews?
How would I talk about Jewish women supporting the queer movement? How would I talk about Jewish role in supporting the queer movement? I have a whole chapter, I'm sorry to say I didn't get to talk about it, which profiles 6 or 7 women who were involved in the Vilde Chayes, the lesbian collective. And I want to say that we owe so much to these women, because of all the women that I'm talking about, these were the ones who were the first to see clearly the multiple forms of oppression, where other women were kind of skirting the way in which they were Jewish and kind of scared of saying who they were for fears of anti-Semitism. The gay and lesbian collective really understood this and profoundly, I think, changed the way that the women's movement embraced queer activism. If not for them, the whole Jewish issue would not be seen. So they made it visible, and I was privy to the papers of these 7 women, including Adrienne Rich, where they talked about kind of getting together, the feeling that they were on a new horizon, knowing that this was so important, you know, kind of saying to each other, let's not have fear, let's go through this, because they were surrounded on all sides by people who were hostile to them, within the Jewish community, within the women's community, within the queer community, because they were Jewish. So it wasn't easy, but yet they did, and some of the largest events in the period that I'm talking about were of Jewish lesbians and gays. You know, thousands of people would attend this. So this was inherent and integral and a change-making part of the story that I tell, and I'm sorry I didn't say it in that depth. Thank you for your question.
Is there another student question? Okay, I'll open it up. Students can ask questions at any moment. But is there someone from the general audience who would like to ask a question? Yes.
The wonderful anecdote.
Oh, yes. It's kind of an anecdote, and I don't think it's confidential, but so 2 women from both sides of the story that I tell. One is Heather Booth that I've mentioned, and the other one, Heather Booth, who's perhaps the greatest organizer in American life of the past 50 years. The other woman I want to mention is Blue Greenberg. Do you know who Blue Greenberg is? Blue Greenberg is an Orthodox Jewish feminist. She founded the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Organization. She's married to a rabbi. She has many children. She writes that Jewish traditional life was very dear to her, so that becoming a feminist was quite difficult. But she's talked about that. And anyway, she came to my conference, and about 3 weeks ago, I got a note from Heather Booth, and she said, I'd like to invite you to a dinner I'm having for my closest friends, about, I don't know how many, but maybe 10 or 15, at Blue Greenberg's house. My friend Blue Greenberg. And what happened, they both wrote to me. They met at my conference. They met again at my book party. And these 2 women who come from totally different aspects, but they are heroes of mine, I worship both of them, have found so much in common that one of them is having a dinner party for her closest friends at the other one's house. And it's kind of life imitating art, or whatever it is that we do as scholars, and gives me a little bit of hope that there are ways in which we can bring people together. We just have to find meeting grounds. So that is the anecdote.
I was curious about Brandeis. Is it a Jewish university? What difference does that make in Jewish history or American history or whatever? That's where you were these days.
We were talking about this just today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've been associated with Brandeis for 60 years, something like that, maybe even longer. Brandeis was founded by the Jewish community as a non-sectarian university from its very beginning. It had people of all faiths, and it proudly claims the way it became a home at last, the title of its founder, Abraham Sacker's book, At Home at Last. As we have come into an era where Black groups and Hispanic groups and others feel that they want to be sure of their identity, it's become a challenge for Brandeis to understand and be explicit about the histories of different groups. And I've been part of a group, including our new president, who's trying to respond to this challenge of understanding, maybe like your own city, the diversity of groups within a larger universe that is Jewish sponsored, Jewish sectarian. Fewer students are Jewish than it used to be. And it's very exciting. It's a very vital place that it is a multi-ethnic community that is sponsored still by the Jewish community in various ways. But that is a challenge, how to do it in a way so that Abraham Sacker said, a host at last. Well, what does it mean to be a host? It means that is everybody at the same table? How are you at the same table? And how to make that possible. So I think it can be invigorating. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Another question?
Over there.
I hope it's okay to make a comment as well, but it'll probably to a question. I did have a little concern when you were mentioning leftist movements and anti-Zionism. And this is in no way to say that there has not been some anti-Semitism, but I think unfortunately there is a tendency to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
Right.
And there's been a lot of people very active, I think, in the feminist movement who have addressed both issues, Israeli policy towards the Palestinians as well as oppression of women. And one particular person that comes to mind is somebody who lived in Albuquerque, a rabbi, Lynn Gottlieb of Nahalat Shalom. And I first met her through a group called New Jewish Agenda when I was in my 20s. A group that, again, looked at a lot of the issues of the time in terms of treatment of Palestinians. But she was also very much of a feminist. And this leads me to the question, because she also battled problems of a woman trying to be ordained as a rabbi. And of course, just on the religious front, things like women at the wall. So I'm just wondering if you could also address the issues of how feminism has played a role in equalizing Jewish theology, in a sense, or within the religious institutional sense, or institutions.
Thank you for your question. It's all very complicated. I didn't mean to reduce feminism anti-Zionist attitudes to one current. And if you read my chapter, which discusses this, I hope you will see that it is complex and deals with the many different colors of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, Zionism, pro-Zionism, etc. In terms of the religious aspect of it, of course I have a chapter on that. Where would the Jewish rabbinate be today without the feminist pioneers who made it more egalitarian through hard work, through struggle, through pain? It wasn't easy, but this has happened in every movement. And there are many different attitudes about religion within the feminist movement. There are many different attitudes about Israel within the feminist movement. I wouldn't say that all are the same and that all are equally legitimate, but I wouldn't squelch any point of view. And to say that on the left there are viable criticisms about Israel and about other kinds of issues certainly is something that I understand.
I was hoping someone else would ask this question, but since nobody has, I will ask it.
Okay.
Because I'm not Jewish, grew up Catholic, I'm not really radical, probably more liberal, but I'm awfully curious about whether you think radical feminists are more likely to have a Jewish background than not. Or do you think that radical feminism actually draws from all different kinds of background, and you have chosen to talk about this particular group because of your own background? Because I've never really given it any thought, but I do wonder, it might be true as a hypothesis, that because of the not quite white perspective that you mentioned,
Yes.
or some of their perspective, it could be true that radical feminists are more likely to come from a Jewish background. So have you given any thought to that?
Again, thank you for a marvelous question. Every question has been challenging and great. Yeah, I've given a lot of thought about that, years of thought. You know, I don't want to draw attention to a particular group when there may be others who have an equal claim, in this case, to radical feminism. But one has to look at the demography. I didn't really talk about the numbers of and percentages of Jews, say, in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Mark Rudd, who was one of the leaders, said at Columbia, you know, our fraternity, our SDS looked like a Jewish fraternity. There were so many Jews there. In terms of the women who went down south, there's been a book written by Deborah Schultz about those women who went down south. She also finds that 2/3 were Jewish. So, I mean, it's not to say that in every case, certainly in every city, I would never think that in the Southwest, the majority of radical feminists were Jewish. The demography doesn't add up that way. So my study is just a few cities where I found them, where I found these groups, and I wouldn't make any larger claims. I'm interested in those women who were feminists, who were interested in social change, who were radicals. If they were Jewish, how did that lead them into this activism, and why? That's really my question. And I think that another historian could look at Protestant or Catholic or Muslim women and ask the same question. You know, were their faith traditions motivators for the kind of change that happened? And for me, discovering that there was a strong ethical tradition and networks, et cetera, that propelled feminist life in the 60s and 70s, that's a significant finding. But I wouldn't claim that's the only thread. It's up for other people to do that work. One of my respondents said, and I throw this out because it seems very interesting to me, that, you know, maybe there was a Catholic trend as well, and somebody should be looking at that, really.
Maybe their parents wouldn't let them go.
Pardon?
Maybe their parents wouldn't let them go to these dangerous things.
Maybe their parents wouldn't let them go. That's a very interesting question, because, you know, I also wrote a book about Jewish mothers, and I've been on a platform with, you know, Irish mothers and others, and we've talked about the different styles of mothering. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Antler. Were the Jewish radical feminists involved in conflicts with other feminist groups, like we hear of the factionalizing
Today.
of the feminist movement?
Mm-hmm.
Were the Jewish radical feminists at odds with some of the other groups, or how did that work? Were they on their own, or did they align themselves? You know, just a question regarding factionalism and this group.
Okay, well, you haven't stumped me, but you brought up a really important aspect which I didn't talk about. Later on in the 80s, there was conflict between Jewish groups and some black groups. There was an important book called Yours in Struggle. I'm forgetting the subtitle. It was 1984, and it was written by a white Southern woman, a Jewish feminist, a Jewish lesbian feminist, and a black woman, Barbara Smith. And it kind of raised these questions about what we have in common and what we have in conflict. And there were real issues. I wouldn't say that these were, you asked about Jewish feminist groups, these were individual women more than they were groups, but sometimes it did lead to sessions of black women or Jewish women meeting together. I actually did not have a chance to put all this in the one book, and I may be continuing this a little bit later, but you're absolutely right. There was conflict, and there was also reconciliation and dealing with some hard truths. Yours in Struggle, it's a hard place, but let's get beyond that hard place. And this was kind of in the 80s.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm curious if you found more than a small number of these radical feminists whose fathers and mothers might have been in the Communist Party, as my father was. So I was brought up completely as a secular Jew, made to go to temple and hated it, so quit. My parents did.
Wait, say that again. You didn't.
When I was brought up as a secular Jew, but my parents forced me to go to temple because we lived in the suburbs.
I see.
And good Jews sent their children to temple. But the ethic I got from my father, which I've only learned recently, maybe 15 years ago, Tikkun Olam, not a phrase he ever used, is something that I feel completely explained his behaviors during the Communist Party ride and went out. And I'm wondering if there is something like, if it's unusual or there's just not enough of these women that you know about. But I'd be very curious to know whether other radical feminists had Communist Party members in their family and their parents.
The answer is yes, quite a substantial number. I didn't do a percentage survey, but quite a number were red diaper babies. On the other hand, there were religious women. There were women like, Esther Rome of Our Bodies Ourselves, who maybe was the most, what does it mean to be radical? I really don't even address that. In different areas, it could mean different things. So that the impulse to seek change, to struggle against your own community, your allies, as I said, many of them had to go against their male allies in the community. That took a tremendous amount of courage. Some of it came from their learning of, Tikkun Olam through parents who were left-wing, but there were others who had different backgrounds. And that was the surprising thing to me, that they sort of came together and kind of worked together. They were not all the same.
Probably in your book, but I'm going to ask anyway.
Sure.
You were talking about the young people. You
Yeah.
said a lot of them were children, but I'd like to know what they're doing. I mean, do they have groups? You said they were young feminists, but I didn't know if they were working in groups or
Today. Yeah, that's another wonderful question. I think what is different today, if we're talking about the Jewishness of young feminists, is that there are groups, there are places for people to go. One of them I mentioned, the Jewish Women's Archive, which is in Boston. Every year they have a couple of dozen rising fellows who are high school students who they bring together and kind of train them and mentor them. And so I think there are places that didn't exist at the time that I was writing about that is different. Again, we live in a politicized world, so not everybody finds her way to these groups, but I think they do exist, right? For high school, for college, hopefully on college campuses. I think so. Over there.
You with your hand up? Yeah.
Hi, it's more of a comment than a question, although you might
Okay,
respond
please.
to it. My daughter is actually attends Brandeis University. She's a senior. She's graduating in December.
Great.
And one of the, sometimes she says things, she's very quiet, but sometimes she says things that startle me. And what she said a couple of summers ago when she was home was, just say no to a Jewish woman. See what happens.
Well, she's your daughter, right? I have daughters myself, so that's a lesson that she learned. Yes. You see, but years ago, and I think that ties to your question, years ago, I think young Jewish women would cower from that. I don't want to be known like that. I don't want to be brash.
But that's the difference.
Yes.
I would have cowered from it, and that's why I'm startled when I hear statements on that.
Yes. It's a generation, a lot has happened in 30, 40 years, but part of it is, I think, peer support and group support, knowing that she's not alone. Everything that the feminist movement did and the structures that we have in society, I think that's very important. And parenting. Ties with Lois's question as well. Yeah. So great. Thank you for your questions.
I'm not going to dare say no to more questions, but I am going to invite people to ask them individually. So why don't we, mix together? We're not going to run away anytime soon. There's plenty of time to meet with the League of Women Voters in the back to see what materials they have, or to sign up to register to vote. I'm looking at the students more specifically. And then also, again, if you want to buy any of her books, it's not just the Jewish Radical Feminism book that's back there, although that's the majority of the stacks. She'd be happy to sign any copies you want to buy.
Absolutely.
And to continue these conversations, you can continue asking questions.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everybody, for some great questions. Good questions.